I mean exploring in time relative to music, and really simple movements, but feeling a connection to your body. And when we hit that beat, we get dopamine. When we feel a connection from one side of our body to the other, we get another huge hit of dopamine. If we do it in conjunction with other people, even something as simply as bouncing in time, we get a massive hit of oxytocin. And all these things make us learn faster.
That was Liz Gleadle, and you're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. If you're a coach looking for an awesome training portal to distribute and track workouts for athletes online or in person, then you can get a free 30-day trial of Team Builder software by heading to teambuilder.com and using the code JUSTFLY. See what Team Builder can do for you and sign up for that free trial today using the code JUSTFLY. Welcome to another episode of the podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Our guest this week is Liz Gleadle. She is a 3-time Olympian, a high-performance consultant, and a TEDx speaker. After retiring from javelin throw in 2022, Liz had a transformative experience, recognizing the profound impact of emotions on posture, movement quality, and power production. Since then, she has unretired and is training with a whole new approach towards the 2024 Olympic Games. For today's show, Liz will be talking about her training process in javelin and how she works to level up athletically using principles of exploration, dance, connection, and flow. This was a really rich conversation for movement learning and multilateral expansion of our athletic abilities. I really enjoyed talking with Liz, and I know you guys will love this one. Let's get to episode 414 here with Liz Gleadle. Liz, it is awesome to have you on the show here. Thanks for joining me today.
Glad to be here. It's going to be fun.
Yeah, so I know we both have the commonality. Well, I mean, I dabbled in javelin. You have been a multi-time Olympian. But tell me about your movement journey and I guess the transformation of yourself as not only a javelin thrower, but just an athlete in general over the decades.
Yeah. So I guess to lead this up a little bit, I had retired about a year and a half ago, or almost 2 years ago. And I was writing a book about high performance habits. And I was thinking about how to help athletes basically take steps forward without trying to throw everything at the wall and seeing what stuck. And in doing this, I kind of realized that emotions that we experience or that we perceive about ourselves, the stories we tell ourselves, really affect the way we move. And I started diving into all the different ways that I had been holding myself back due to my thoughts about my lack of athleticism, my lack of being able to jump, my lack of explosiveness, my klutziness. And I realized that it had completely dictated the way I moved as a thrower and as an athlete. And it had completely held me back from reaching my peak. So I took since having that realization, I decided to unretire. And I've been exploring a lot of dance, a lot of understanding how emotional states affect the way we move immediately and our power output, and moved into acrobatics and started integrating all of this into the movement of the throw. So since then, I've learned how to do things I never thought possible. I figured out how to hit a beat, how to dance, how to do a backflip, and my throw has completely changed. And my personal capacity and the things that I dare to try has transformed from this place of fear to excitement, which has really changed how quickly I learn. So that's kind of where I'm at with it.
Yeah. Within that, like, I guess going into maybe some of the layers of that, I suppose where you probably were, I'd imagine like traditional training, like heavy weightlifting, more maybe an approach to technique that's more like, here's the drill, here's the position, do it this way. Can you speak to a little bit more of how do those things look like now compared to what those things looked like 10 years ago?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was on a very heavy lifting program. At one point, I was doing Olympic lifts 6 times a week between Monday and Friday. And, I've cleaned to 215 pounds, not kilos. I've got good numbers in the gym, but I didn't understand elasticity. And I would be in javelin, we talk about positions. And when we think about positions, we think about poses, we think about stills, because that's how we understand these things. And although I could hit these positions, I realized I didn't know how to get in and out of them really. I understood what I was aiming for, like a target, but I didn't understand the flow through it and the connection and the fascial pull through it. So now when I think about stuff, I don't think about it as positions. I think about them as dance moves. And I think about Javelin as a choreography with several dance moves in it. And when I was taking dance this year, I realized that where I would get lost in dance class was the fact that it's choreography. And I couldn't remember all the movements, or they teach you 3 movements and then another 3 movements, but I wouldn't understand the connection between 3 and 4. And it was these in-between moves that I believe were missing in a lot of places. For example, in Javelin, you run forward and then you transition or you withdraw, and that within itself is a move. But I'd never isolated that movement within itself to understand that dance move. And so the way I've gotten away from old training is this way that, yes, power is very important, but the more we understand the specificity of the dance move of every aspect of the choreography that we are trying to achieve, the easier it is to then add power to it later because you have the precision first.
Yeah, it's interesting how we typically tend to view the process of movement and technique in the sense of, I think a lot of times people start with like positions on a piece of paper or the computer. You took a video, you were in this position here. That's pretty good. We need you to get in that position. But there's not, like you said, well, what about the actual timing and the actual movement, the dance that happens? I mean, you could even say between the positions, but you could also just say in general. And I think something I've been really, really interested in is how like movement, timing, rhythm, you could say frequency if you want to use that word, starting from that point almost forms the, I guess, positions, if you want to say that. Like it's like, well, where did those positions come from in the first place? It came from this underpinning group of other activities. And even Gary Ward, who's a biomechanist and talks about the foot, has said this in his book, is that there's no such thing as this static neutral. He had said center is always kind of floating back and forth. Yeah, this isn't a visual, sadly, but I'm like moving my pen back and forth. Yeah, you're moving your head back and forth.
I'm waving my
yeah. There's always this like floatingness to it. I think it's almost like sometimes coaches crave static for certainty. Oh, we're certain about this static thing, and that's how we can measure progress. But in reality, the actual being in the movement and embodying it, there's certainly, yeah, it's definitely, you're getting into dancing territory now.
Yeah, absolutely. It's remember when I was having a year of fun. So I finished the Olympic year. I was really disappointed. I felt like I'd had no fun. So I decided to go visit all these places, see these great javelin throwers. And I went to Trinidad, and they have soca there. They love to dance. And I noticed I was at this party and everybody's dancing. And they're all doing this dance together. And I look at my friend Keishorn Walcott. He's a Olympic champion from 2012. And I'm like, how are they doing that movement? And he looks at me like it's like, duh. And he's like, just bounce. And I was like, bounce. And I realized I didn't know how to bounce properly to a beat. And that's the thing about all of these movements is that realistically, if you hold a javelin position statically, like that's really hard to do. And not only that, you don't really get into it that way. You kind of bounce into it, so to speak, and you increase the tension by not muscular tension, but by finding these endpoints of the elastic recoil. And you bounce into those extended positions and you bounce out of it. And bounce is a simplified word, but it's like the storage and release of energy. And so I started looking for the bounce in everything. And you can think of it instead of like a dance move, it's like, are you bouncing in it? Are you floating in it? Are you like, there's all these different textures. And so it's like, it's the texture of how you get in and out of it that makes it more exploratory and makes it easier to get into those and out of those positions.
Yeah, one of the movements, or just I wouldn't even call it on an exercise, a thing you do that I've been enjoying a lot more. I do it pretty much every morning. People probably see me and think I'm crazy, but I just get out and try to get morning sunlight, and I just do like shaking motions, like, qigong, or just shaking it. What if you see animals just shaking out their limbs? I just do that for like 5 minutes and feels good. But I see how much of that just looseness shows up in good athletic movement. It's such a good primer. I love when you were talking about the bounce. A couple things sprang to mind that I wrote down is that I think sometimes we try to reduce movement down to this point where it's totally static. Like, for example, in sports performance or sports science, it's like, okay, well, let's get your standing vertical jump where you get a counter movement. You can bounce out of the bottom basically. And then let's start you where you're static. You have to hold the squat and jump up using only your muscles. And what people find is that even in that static jump where you're supposed to be static, people still cheat it just a little bit. They still dip down just the littlest bit just to get that grab of energy, or like a block start in track where it's like you're starting in a static position. But what do people do once the gun goes out? Their shins drop down to grab elastic energy, and they have this shin drop. So there's going to be this drop with gravity to prime and bounce. Like it's everywhere. So yeah, I can totally see that. And you were talking about dancing, and I think we'll get along to this. One of the graphs or charts you had written up, you talk about lateral quests. And I do want to keep getting on that container of movement. How do we develop like embodied movement? I will say too, I did want to say that I think it's easy to just totally scrap like the positions and shapes. And I only say that in the sense, sometimes I think they're there so we can outgrow them. Like I think I actually am glad that I had gone through the phase where here's all the positions you hit. And I think it's actually good to have that, but I think they're there so that you can eventually, you have to get beyond them. It has to become an integrated feeling at some point. But I do think, I don't think, I don't think that we should just throw them all away. I do think it's good to have that in the system. And then eventually you understand what it's like to move fluidly between all those and really just pass them. I was going to ask you too. Sorry, I was like, okay, what the question I was going to ask, lateral quests. So you mentioned dancing, and I think it's interesting when we talk about, well, how do skills come along? Do you just keep doing the same skill over and over? Like if you throw javelin, do you just throw javelin and that's all? I mean, obviously, right, we lift and we do plyos and sprints, but I think it's even more than that. And when you talk about dance and lateral quests, tell me a little bit more about how you see those benefits of other skill sets that can improve the main thing that you're working on.
Yeah. Well, it's like anything, right? You start with training and then you work on nutrition and then you do, some meditation or you work on your sleep. Like all these things we understand. If we understand these lateral skills and have any habit is a lateral skill better, then it has an effect that feeds back into other things that we're doing. So for other lateral skills, for example, like dance, or even I like to say, I like to try and be a master object manipulator. So I throw a ball, I throw a 500-gram ball, I throw a baseball, I'll throw a club around, I'll throw a rope around. And in understanding these separate objects and understanding them in their uniqueness, then we understand how they're different. And we also understand how they're the same. And it's like throwing a 700-gram javelin or a 600-gram javelin. They're a little different, but they're very minorly different to the point that if you're not skilled enough at it, or you don't understand the nuance of it, you might not really feel the difference or understand how you need to move differently to affect that object optimally. And so it's in expanding ourselves or doing dance, for example, that we leave the javelin behind, or we leave the thing that we're trying to do behind. We understand something else. And when we come back to the javelin, we are new because we have new information. We have a new understanding. And now our perspective shifts because we've expanded and we can understand that thing more deeply.
Yeah. It's almost like a mini little hero's journey. You kind of depart from the typical, the known, you learn something from the unknown, and then you bring it back into, the thing you were doing. And I think,
Absolutely.
Yeah, I always feel like there's like the technical side of that, but then there's also like kind of the mental and, the side of that that's maybe a little bit more between the lines or a little bit more gray too.
Yeah, well, I think what held me back from doing this kind of stuff for so long was there's research and there's science saying if you do X, it should give you Y. Like there's a 0.72 positive correlation between how much you snatch and how far you throw a javelin. My snatch is horrendous, yet I've thrown almost 65 meters. So it's like, okay, it's not the only thing. And there's a lot less studies done on how dance relates to javelin. And we have to be sometimes willing and brave to say, I feel like there's a correlation here, but there's no evidence showing correlation, or no one else is doing this. And so it feels really scary to go and do something when no one else has done it. And what I've learned from stepping greatly outside of this, for the longest time, I was like, I feel like there's a connection here. I'm understanding something between dance and javelin that I've never understood before. and I know it's connected, but I'm not 100% sure how, but I need to find out more to understand it. And so it's got to be that willingness sometimes to go really outside the box where there's a barely a connection, but you feel it kind of in your soul. And that's where I think, we can do a little bit more within side quests, where if something is really exciting or interesting to you, chances are it's probably related to something else that you're trying to figure out. And subconsciously, you know it. And sometimes we ignore that and say, but the science. And it's like, well, there just isn't science for this other thing yet. Or no one's made the exact correlation and printed it and made it really public.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about. You almost have two ways. And I think they don't have to be mutually exclusive at all, but there's the way of looking in athletics as, purely do this, it transfers this way. And I'm sure you can get great results doing that. But at the same time, from the human experience, is it fun? I don't know. Is it fun to do that your whole life? For whatever your movement practices, isn't it fun to do, think of your life as this accumulation of unique experiences, and not only the activity, but also the feelings that gave you, the joy of that movement. And how can I take a little bit of that into this unique, body that I have with all the skills I have and output that. And I'd imagine too, like you talk about with dance, like it would be hard to imagine your former self basically like being the same as that, like not being able to dance and take in that, what dance has given you just from a general movement perspective.
Yeah, it's given me a couple things in the way that I understand how to continue motion now. I understand momentum in a way that I've never understood momentum before, because it was always scary to try and throw a javelin with significant momentum, because there are consequences if you do it wrong. There's not as many consequences if you screw up a pirouette.
Yeah.
And there needs to be more simplification in these areas to basically say, like, okay, I'm going to explore this thing that I've never done before. Like doing a jump kick in the air is kind of scary. Doing it into a foam pit is not very scary. And that's what I like about dance, is that you can try, when I say dance, I don't mean choreographed dance or having to follow a specific way of moving. I mean exploring in time relative to music, and really simple movements, but feeling a connection to your body. And when we hit that beat, we get dopamine. When we feel a connection from one side of our body to the other, we get another huge hit of dopamine. If we do it in conjunction with other people, even something as simply as bouncing in time, we get a massive hit of oxytocin. And all these things make us learn faster. And that's what was really interesting to me above all else. I was like, I need to learn quickly. It's not just what it's showing me, it's the speed at which it makes me learn and the reps that I can accumulate without consequences and without massive tax on the body. And then I can then go and apply it straight after to throwing.
Yeah. So basically you're saying like on one end, you have typical throwing, which is very high. I guess I'll use the word cost. I don't know. Like it's intense.
Intensity, high neural cost.
Yeah.
Massively high neural cost.
Yeah. And then on the other end, you could do like, maybe like a rope flow or something with a repeatable, something that's repeatable. You can rhythmically continue it. The thing that comes to mind, does this tool exist? It's almost like a ball on a rope that you could just keep like whipping around in a continuing fashion, in a rhythmic fashion. And I think we so undervalue things that have rhythmic potential, especially if we look at just like singular, okay, it's a javelin, you run up and it's a one shot, or even high jump, right? Like it's a run up and you have this one thing, but it's just so much easier to learn once you could just keep continuing, and it almost becomes its own like meditation, but it gives you more room to find that thing that you can then put into the singular output. I know when I was coaching javelin, this was in my late 20s, and this is just what made sense to me, is I would often have athletes, instead of telling them, hey, do this with your arm or your leg or whatever, especially even in competitions, I remember I'd say, hey, go do this like kind of repeatable foot turn drill or something like 10 times and then go throw again. Or something. That's kind of, I just always felt like that was so much more beneficial than just saying, do something, now go maximal, hit these positions. I felt like that never really worked that well.
Yeah, I like the intention behind things. So even like rope flow is dance. It's connecting, it's basically creating an energy line literally between your hands so that you understand how one hand affects the other hand, and how you produce energy through your body and how it comes through your arms, and how you transfer energy to an object but then how you recycle that energy.
Mm.
And so I think this is actually something that is missing from a lot of throwing programs is people try and create energy within a system, like a clean. You just lift it up and then you hold it. But they don't recycle that energy. It
Yeah.
stops. Versus rope, you're like, okay, I'm going to hit myself, which means I didn't continue the momentum. So I didn't understand how to continue moving the energy.
Mm.
And if you understand how to recycle energy within a rope, then you'll start understanding how to throw the rope. And that's where the intention comes in. Okay, am I throwing the rope up and then letting gravity and momentum take it over here? Or am I throwing it down and assisting gravity and momentum and then allowing that momentum to carry the rope up? And that's what's really cool about these motions. You're like, spin on this foot and spin fast this way every time. And then it's like, okay, now try and spin, like now add the intention or the speed at this place. And it helps people understand where their energy is going. And they focus on the energy and where it's going and following it versus trying to put a limb in space and time and trying to understand it relative to a visual standpoint. You understand it on a physical, energetic standpoint.
Yeah, it kind of drives home experiential learning more. It's something you can't. It's almost like a gateway too to give you that thing that maybe even the coach didn't tell you what to expect. You just do something rhythmically enough times, and things start to emerge. Especially if you're looking for them. I think there's probably a lot of athletes who would, and maybe some who don't care as much either. But I think that's one of those main places you can find those things.
And it's even like, I love saying, like the difference in how much something weighs. You say like, okay, well, pretend like you're throwing a med ball that weighs 30 pounds. Someone's going to like drop down low, get their arms out wide, like squat, and then try and throw this really heavy thing over their shoulder. And they say, okay, now pretend what med ball weighs 4 pounds. They're going to just drop and then shoot their arms up towards the sky. And it's going to have this ballistic component. You didn't need to tell them how to change that. You just needed to give them a different type of intention. And even the difference within like a heavier rope, like a very slightly or heavier standard RMT, like David Weck style rope, versus like this skinny little like rock climbing rope, gives you a completely different feeling and helps you feel into these different positions and different intentions.
Yeah. So where, like, if your practices these days, so what does it look like? A lot of like rhythmic work and then bleeding into throwing? Do you go back and forth like between a throw and then rhythm type work? How does this give me a few examples of how some things you're really working through and exploring with that?
Yeah. So for warm up for throws practice, I'll start with a lot of core work. So it'll kind of look like Kundalini yoga, where like I'll be sitting on the ground, I'll ground my hips because the engine is the spine, and I'll start moving my spine from this place on the floor and breathing into it and getting things moving. And I'll start doing it to rhythm, and I'll start doing spinal waves, and I'll kind of really get the middle moving, and then I'll start bouncing to a beat. And it'll start getting to my legs, into my knees. I'll bounce at different heights. I'll bounce more from the knees or from the ankles. I'll do a little bit of footwork to get my feet moving and in relation to each other moving through space. I'll make it fun. Then I'll often add in some arm swings or rope flow. I actually just learned how to whack this weekend, which is really simple. It's just moving your arms through space to very specific locations, but understanding hand position as well, because it creates different fascial tension. And that then prepares me to tie the arms into the core and then time it to the rest of the body. And then once I get into the rope flow, then I really understand where I'm putting energy and I'm watching how it moves. And it allows me to bounce, to spin, and to make everything coordinated at once. At that point, then I'll actually move into some running, which is not a lot of running. It's just enough to feel the whole system and make it relative to Javelin. And then I might use a club because a club is heavier, and I'll do some basic throw patterns with a club, which has now been primed with everything else tied in. And notice how I've kind of started with movement, slow movement, connecting the movement, adding something, a tool to connect it even more, then adding something heavier, and then adding a little bit of ballistic, and then adding something else heavier, and then now getting into throw. And then so now I've recycled movement, and now I'm going into recycled energy. Now I'm going into releasing the energy. And I'll go into some ball throws. And I might start with baseballs or a 500 gram or a 1 kilo to feel a little more weight and to feel into my core. I might go short range with my arms or long range. It really depends on basically I'm constantly asking myself, where do I feel like, do I have the connection line all the way from fingertip to toe across my body, the same sides of my body, between my legs, between my arms? And where am I missing it? And what do I need to do to activate that part of the line so that the whole line can be connected? And that is a question I'm constantly asking myself when I'm throwing.
Today's podcast is sponsored by my favorite jump testing and training device, the Plyomat. If you want a jump mat that can not only get standard counter movement jumps and reactive jumps, but also is something you can put into your standard plyometric training, such as hurdle hops and bounds, to gather not only height, but reactive strength, contact time, and add that extra dynamic to your total training session, then check out the Plyomat, and you can head to plyomat.net, that's PLYOMAT.net, to learn more. Yeah, I love how I'm going to have to write that down. And like sometimes just doing the pod, I'm doing this, I'm like looking at questions. I'm like, all right, what am I going to, and I'm like, that's awesome. If I just dwelled on that, then you'd see a blank stare on my face for what I was going to ask you next. But I was thinking about how that fits with like team sport. People always find if you're going to time a 30-meter dash or a vertical jump, team sport is without fail an incredible way to warm up for those things. And within team sport, you have, yes, explosive bursts, and it is community and social, and you get the aerobic system going and blood, and muscle temperature, all these things. But you also have like a lot of like little bounces, kind of like little bounce, go, little bounce, and you're dropping with gravity. And there's all these different ways that you're exposing your body to little bounces and drops and goes, and then realignments and vision. I just think I always look at how can I make, I'm always looking at how do I take these universal principles and try to put it into a skill. And so I just find it really fascinating how you go through that. I love too that intermediate piece, like you had mentioned, like the ball instead of the javelin, it's a lower fear piece. Like you can do more with it. You have more freedom with that thing before you step up to the actual. And I think about that too with like team sport movement. Most of it, you're not asked to do a single maximal like long jump in team sport. It's just a bunch of like, maximal in the emotional perspective, but it's like repeatable, task oriented, and you just keep flowing through these things versus I think the way we typically think is, okay, do this max effort, rest 60 seconds, do another max effort, rest. And I think there's a lot more waves in the process than that, especially with like the down waves, things that dip into the sensation, rhythm, and the feeling of something. And then you take that back with you into that maximal output. And I loved I was just going to say, I'll go back through and I'll write that down later, the little series there. But I think that formula is applicable to just about anything. Even, I was just going to say too, with, I've been doing some workouts that involve hurdling recently, and I warm up for those a lot with a lot of barefoot work on slant boards that have like a slip grip texture and all sorts of different ways to expose my foot to lateral forces, medial forces, more toe oriented lengthening forces. And my goal is that when I get to that hurdling, I feel the gift that slant board gave me that still is existing in the tensioning, the way my foot tensions itself. And I want that tensioning to be more robust than if I just like, all right, we're just going to start hurdling, going through all these positions. Here we go. Which again, I mean, if you have those things already, like you have a super athlete who already has it, you can do that, but I think it's always good to also recalibrate too, even then you kind of want to go into that. So you got me going on a tangent. I'm sorry. But I thought that process was really cool there. And especially too with like, those intermediates that reduce the fear. I was also trying to think of where else that would work with other skills, like jumping and sprinting or sport movement. I'm sure sport movement a ton, because I'm sure there's tons of fear, other players on the field, particular situations. I mean, this is a little bit of a tale, but I know I had a lot of fear if other people were more athletic than me. So I'm already thinking like, what's the intermediate for that would have helped me in that situation? I just think there's so many ways that you can take that principle of fear and finding an intermediate, like a place to explore and work through that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, feet are really an interesting part. So like I've had 15 ankle sprains, Achilles tendonitis in both my Achilles, bursitis, plantar fasciitis. I've had a broken toe. Like I've done all kinds of horrible things to my feet. And it was partially because I hated them, because I'm 6'1" and I have size 13 men's feet. And I love my feet now. They do so many great things for me. But I had to get to this place where it's like, okay, if I'm separate from my feet and I hate them, I'm literally like, my brain is saying like, these don't belong to me. So how can I possibly not control them, but like have them integrated and have them work for me if I don't have a good relationship to them?
Yeah.
And even within like those hurdle drills, like your feet have something like over 200,000 nerve endings. Like they're the places that give you so much information about what's going on. They're often like, we understand if we're running or we're moving and we're not touching anything else, we're not anchored to anything else. We might have the feeling of gravity or the air on our skin, but like the most robust sensation is within our feet. And even something talking about fear and going over hurdles, like what's one of the most common fears? Hitting a hurdle, hitting your shin, hitting your foot, landing wrong. And so a lot of that can be addressed. It's like, okay, let's play the game of I'm going to land on the edge of my foot and then I'm going to spiral off to the side. Let's play the game of, okay, I'm going to like roll onto my toes and then fall forward. What happens? And playing within like those safe environments and testing out your feet in all these different ways and realizing all the amazing things they can do, all the information that they can give you. Okay, what if I close my eyes? But I'm just walking. We all like, veer to one side or something, or you can even play the game of like, okay, what if I'm just kind of spinning back and forth and my eyes are closed? Then all of a sudden, all of this information becomes incredibly accessible to you. You've gamified it, so it becomes fun. And if we learn 20 to 40 times faster in play than we do in work, then we've just gamified our feet and we understand all these things. And then when we go to do the actual thing, we feel confident because we've just tested out all of these variables and it allows us to activate in real time.
Yeah. I like the way you said that, gamify the feet, or like, it's not just, hey, do this exercise, like, and it's going to give you a superpower. It's how you go through that exercise that gives you that superpower that you can engage in everything else. And yeah, like what you said with the hurdles, one thing I've been doing just recently, and I used to run the 42-inch highs in college, but it's funny because I'll warm up now. I always think this is so interesting to me is the track hurdles. I don't want to make this, completely about track, but like the lowest they go, just for example's sake, is 30 inches, which is fine. But if you're doing like plyometrics and hurdle hops, that's actually not really low, especially for a lot of people. Or even hurdling. And I think in Europe, they actually, for women's hurdles, I think they have hurdles that go like 27 and 24. And when I do hurdles now, I mean, I'll warm up. It sounds crazy. I warm up on 12-inch hurdles just because it's so fast and it's all about the feet. It's just da-da-da, da-da-da, and you just feel in the feet. And how are my feet working? And what's the rhythm of this? Before you even worry about the trail leg or anything else. And you build off that. And by the time you get up to whatever it is, 36, like your feet are flying and everything is so smooth. But if you just go straight to positions, all right, I'm going to do my dynamic stretches. I'm going to do my positions. I'm not saying that can't work, but I think sometimes we leave behind like the rhythm and the timing and those little more nuanced pieces of it. So I guess my hurdling parallel, I was going to say too, I think when people do sprint drills, like over the wickets, like, 8 inches, I find if you just put a stick on the ground, like in my opinion, it actually works a lot better a big majority of the time because there's not this like, it seems silly. It's like, oh, this little 8-inch thing, but honestly, just a little thing on the ground makes a change in movement. And there's absolutely zero, like, I don't know, it's just faster. There's something about it. So figured I'd throw that in there, but.
Yeah, I like to think of it as, so like I've had an extreme fear of jumping. I went over a hurdle in 2018 for a hurdle hop and I removed like a solid 2 inches of my shin. And so like, my left foot clips the front, I take off the front of my left shin. My right heel clips the top, but my right foot goes over. So I Charlie horse myself on my right leg and then I sprain my right ankle. And I'm laying on the ground. I'm like, I'm never doing another hurdle in my life. Like, screw this. And I was so afraid of jumping. And when I just got back into jumping this year, like I was terrified to jump onto a 12-inch box. And rightly so. I've got this program in my system now that like, I'm going to eat it. And that's really scary. So I remember when I was like working with the guy I was working with who's teaching me about jumping, we were jumping onto soft things. We went to a parkour gym and just like removing all of these fear variables, no matter how small, the fact that I knew I could smack my shin as hard as I could on a soft mat and it would be okay, allowed me to open up and move differently. And so it's like when we remove these variables, even when they seem really small, like the fear of like, what if I step on this hurdle wrong and I land on my foot wrong and I break my foot? Like that's a real fear for people, whether they realize it or not. And so, like you said, just putting a stick on the ground and completely removing the variable of this will hurt me and putting it to a place where there's absolute confidence that you can try something and you're going to try something definitely screw up, but it's definitely not going to hurt you, is an amazing way to take your body out of this locked, physically tight movement based on fear, because people who are scared move differently than people who are confident. And then it allows us to actually practice moving with confidence. And then we can try that in really small skills, and it builds, because it's about moving as a confident person, not moving as a person who's terrified, who's going to do something and hopes it works out okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. I was thinking as you were talking even about like in the weight room too. It's interesting. And I think there's absolutely value to the barbell lifts, but I think it's interesting watching athletes move with a barbell on their back, especially a heavy barbell versus, and they can, certainly athletes can and learn to do that, but versus like a Kaiser squat jumper or like a super cat or something where there's like, it's shoulder pads and you're still moving a vertical load. But now you have when you're in the machine with the pads, you have no fear basically of what's going to happen if I jump as high as I can and now something comes down. You remove that break, and just the difference in outputs I've seen, especially explosive athletes on the Kaisers with the wattage. I'm like, wow, this is serious. Like you would not be getting this with just typical squatting. And so it's interesting to think through the layers of how things are. And maybe, it's interesting, you could say squat versus deadlift, you're going to be explosive or whatever. But yeah, I think it's interesting to think about how athletes process that in a gym setting or with anything like that as well.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I really disliked with barbell lifts was that I didn't like loading my spine, because Javelin is about floating the bones, creating this length and creating this fascial length all across your body. And if you keep compressing your spine, well, you're stopping the fascial system.
Yeah.
From actually working properly. And I realized I was like, I have to twist and I have to do all this stuff. And I understand that we're trying to load my legs, but I don't understand how this is making my spine move better. And Javelin is like, if your spine is everything. Your spine holds all the motor programs. It's where your central nervous system is. And if everything's bunched, then you're going to get weird signals, or you're going to be not paying attention to those signals because you've been blatantly ignoring your body's lack of joy in moving in under a squat position and in this in this place of intensity. So I agree, like same thing, like put on the pit shark, put it on my hips. All right, let's move some load. Like I'm excited. Like this is the place I want to move from. And so like if an athlete has an extreme aversion to a lift, it's not because they're a wuss, and it's not because they don't want to work hard. It's because there's something in their body screaming at them that this is a bad idea. And if the idea is to load the legs or understand a movement or create power, there's so many more ways to do that than a metal bar that's 45 pounds. There's just so many ways to do it. It's about how the whole body is connected, not disconnecting the rest of the body from the legs, loading it, making you kind of freak out on your nervous system and then trying to push it. Some people love it. That's great. If they love it, it's totally working for them. If they don't love it, it's a problem.
Yeah, I do wonder about that in the sense of like, a lot of heavy lifting for a long time can cause negative changes with just how we function elastically and with the rebound of the body. And part of me also wonders if there's a little bit of a psychological piece of that, in the sense of, to repeatedly lift a very heavy weight, you kind of have to desensitize some of those finer pieces of movement. I think you could, you like you said, it's the wave, right? Like you go into the bottom and it's all the sensory and the rhythm and the rebounding, and then you go back. I guess if I've found anything over time is the more I go into the rhythm and the elasticity, the more I'm kind of like my ceiling of what I feel I need with the maximal strength kind of drops a little bit. It's even recently, for me, it's just turned into a couple singles with a heavy hex bar, and that's it. It's like, I'm good. That's good there. Let me go back to all the speedy stuff. So it's it's interesting when you dip between the pure strength and then the body awareness, for lack of a better word.
Totally. And like the way I really like to think about training in general for any modality, whether it's plyometrics or lifting or dancing, the question is, what is the highest return on investment that you could be doing right now? Like, that is always the question. Like, if you're injured, the highest return on investment is not lifting heavy. It's doing your rehab. Like that's the thing. If you want to throw Javelin further, probably the highest return on investment is throwing stuff. Unless you don't know, you've never thrown something before, then it's probably recycling movement or recycling momentum. And so there's always that thing where I think, okay, am I strong enough? did I do enough weight training or enough strength training at a certain speed with isometrics or with anything else to prevent injury at these really ballistic end ranges that I'm doing? Yes or no? And beyond that, it's like, okay, if 20% of the work gets you 80% of the results as per Pareto's law, have I satisfied this? And have I looked after my base? And is this giving me the biggest return on investment? Always. And that's the thing that we forget about Javelin specifically is like, it's a 600-gram implement, or for men, it's 8. And so men need a little bit more strength training because their implement is heavier. But for women, it's the lightest event in track. And so you can be strong as you want. If you don't throw that thing specifically through the point with momentum, tapping into your fascial system, it goes nowhere. It's like throwing a paper airplane roll.
Yeah.
It's embarrassing.
Yeah. I know when I threw picking up the women's jab just to do some light implement throwing, I'm like, this thing is so light. Like you would look at it and you wouldn't think it's that light. That thing is.
I throw a 700-gram better than I throw a 6.
Really? That's. Yeah. I know when I was playing, I was on a huge disc golf kick for a long time. I think, I've seen a lot of javelin throwers actually do disc golf in the off season. And I remember one of the originators, a guy who I think owned his own disc golf company, but he always talked about light discs for technique and heavy discs for power. I mean, it makes sense, and I always had the hardest time throwing a light disc well. And I never really embraced it either because I was just like, I just want to throw hard, but I think if I would go back, and I do hope my kids are getting old enough, maybe they can play with me. I don't know. I need to validate going off to the disc golf course. But to me, it'd be a lot of fun. And as to your point of throwing different javelins, I think maybe in my former time, and when I was playing, it was in my early 20s. It was a very exploring more the max strength and a lot of the more structured, more traditional elements. Now, if I could go back to that time, or even now, I would love to, all right, let me throw this disc that weighs 70%. Let me see how that flies. And I understand the value where I don't think I really truly understood that value before. And it also, just makes you a more complete player. But it also, it's like in throwing all those implements at all those different weights and being able to control it too. I almost think of if you had all these different javelins, could you hit the same target with all those javelins? Just, hey, hand me a 600. Can you hit the target? Hand me a 500. And having that control, I just, I see that as so much more valuable with this base. And I know you had talked about an upward spiral of that inspired my thought process, an upward spiral of abilities. I'd imagine would that, how does something like that fit into how you see the ultimate development of leveling up as an athlete?
Yeah. So the way I used to think about that too, heavier is for, trying to develop strength and light is for develop technique and speed. And yes, they do that. However, what I like to think is, what is this 700-gram teaching me about javelin that I cannot see with a 6?
Interesting.
So the same thing, if you throw a 1-kilo ball versus a 600-gram ball, you will be very aware where you are letting go or where the break in the chain is. And it'll make it incredibly obvious to you because it'll hurt like hell. And so then you start to move differently in order to throw that implement differently. Now, that's a really big jump, 600 grams to 1 kilo. But then you say, okay, I understand the difference between a 6 and a 1 kilo, or a 600 gram and a 1 kilo. Now, what's the difference between a 6 and an 8? What's the difference between a 6 and a 7? And so when you keep comparing it back towards the middle, each one teaches you something different. And for example, if I throw something light, like a 5, that'll show me where I'm relying on the implement to do the work for me versus where do I need to do the work. So people release a light javelin really early because they're pretending like there's an extra 100 grams assisting them in holding their arm back versus adding a little bit of a bounce or a pulse to keep that arm back longer. So that's why sometimes people say women's javelin sometimes has a better technique because we are forced to hold those positions ourselves versus having the implement hold them for us. But then in a really heavy implement, you have to find a way to create the power from lower down because you cannot make your extremities handle that nuance. It's too much for them. So it forces you to focus back on the middle and how everything else is set up to support the extremities. So yes, it's power. Yes, it's speed and technique, but it's forcing you to understand how the whole is related to the middle or to the outside. And in understanding that, then it creates an upward spiral of understanding technique, understanding your body, understanding how things are connected. And then okay, well, if I'm not doing, what am I doing wrong here? Where am I missing it? Okay, well, this implement, if I throw it a little, is going to teach me what I need to do. It's going to make me do it, or it's going to embarrass me if I don't. And then I'll come back to the original implement. So it's using these things as individual teachers for different aspects of tech.
Yeah, I really love that idea of, it kind of goes along with the thing of you classifying something as purely transfer, which is good. But part of that transfer is, I feel like it can be a more comprehensive piece if you also look at it as a teacher. What does this thing, here's the 500 gram teacher. It's going to teach me this. Here's the 700 gram. And not just, hey, I'm just throwing this. It's going to, like I said, I kind of generalized there. This is the technique thing. I do this for technique or speed. I think that's the thing too. Hey, we're just going to do this for more arm speed. I remember when I was throwing, there was a lot of talk about throwing with exclusively light implements in the off season to, I guess, and it was for that. It was like, to teach speed. That was the only thing it was framed as. And well, I mean, the ironic thing is I was not a technically good thrower with any sort of approach. At speed was not, I threw my personal best my first year off 4 steps, 2 lefts, because I couldn't handle anything else. So if you say, hey, Joel, you're going to learn speed, well, my technique isn't good enough to do this. So it's just interesting that we tend to make things so polarized. It's only this, when in reality, like you said, it's going to teach you to actually not rely on the implement. Like you're going to have to work your arm and in space. And even for me, like I wasn't that fast at throwing a baseball, but I could throw the men's javelin pretty well because I kind of could just I could just let it hang out there. And I was pretty good with the lower body, high jump and triple jump and all that stuff. And I was bendy enough that I could make it work. But it's interesting as you say that, because I'm like, oh man, I got to go get a 500 now. And there are 600 and toss that around. It's such an interesting way of putting that.
Yeah. And the way I like to think about it is to understand an object, you have to, for example, if you're throwing a club or a rope around, if you throw a club around wrong, it's not going to feel good. And so first of all, you are sentient. The object is not. Like the object isn't going to make your arm fast. You have to understand the object in order to make your arm go fast. So you start with saying, okay, it's like a dance partner. Again, everything is a dance move. And you say, okay, like let's pretend it's a club. We're like, okay, it's weighted this way. It swings like this. It's a pendulum. Okay. And you kind of move it around. And the point is to see how you can move and dance with it smoothly. The point is to make it beautiful. That's what dancing is. It's about grace. And grace is a combination of power and precision. It's the exact amount of power applied precisely and not a degree more than you have precision. You may not increase power beyond precision. You may always increase precision beyond power, but not the other way around. And when you start dancing with an object, you cannot overpower it. Just like if you were a man dancing with a woman and you try and just chuck her in the air and you've never thrown a woman in the air before, well, she's not going to land very well and she's not going to want to dance with you again. So it's the same thing with the implement. Okay, how do we spin it? Oh, it's like this. Okay, let's spin it a bunch of times. Let's make it beautiful. Okay, now I understand the spin. And then once you've danced with something and you've figured out how to move with it, you understand its qualities. You understand how much it weighs. You understand how it relates to gravity. You've hit yourself with it once or twice. Then you say, okay, now I can lead this object in a dance. Now I am confident enough that I can start doing that. Now, how good of a dancer you are with that object or with the rate that you're moving will then dictate how many tricks you can do with it or how powerfully you can do those things. And so as soon as we start understanding it's a dance, we have to pay attention to our dance partner. We have to understand our dance partner deeply. And the more deeply we understand it, the more things that we can do. And this is when objects seem magical, is because we understand it so deeply that we can make it do something amazing. And that's when we have this deep reverence for something, for our dance partner, for an object, for whatever. It's because we understand it inside and out.
Yeah, it makes me think about like just the value of tools, like a safer thing that you can really get good at to help give you a piece of confidence. And I love what you said about precision. And I'll take this just back to the team sport piece I was talking about. Was everything in team sport is done with precision. Pass to this person. There's a precision there. Run to this spot at this time. And yes, sometimes some sprints are faster, more urgent than others. Some are maximal, but everything has a task to it. And I was watching a video. Jean-Pierre Egger did this. He was the coach of Werner Gunther with all those really well-seen Werner Gunther videos. And he was talking about medicine ball throws. And he was saying how he always uses a target, always throw to a target. Because there has to be, you can't just, it's like, okay, well, because it's kind of funny to think, okay, just throw this thing as hard as you can. And you don't know necessarily where it's going to land or how far. So it's like, it's interesting how the body answers that, right? You might throw harder with the arms or the legs, or where's the timing? It's just kind of maximal, just kind of a, So I like thinking about, I've definitely moved towards like everything has to have some sort of precision to it. And there might be a maximal there, but it might not be in exactly the way we start out thinking about maximal. But I think there's beauty in that.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Liz, tell me a little bit more about, you mentioned jumping, your feet, you're disconnected from that. And I think you had even said, I'm not sure if it was on this podcast or in a previous conversation, but that wasn't like a big part of your throw. You just had a really strong arm in the past. Tell me a little bit about how you revitalized your relationship with jumping and running and your feet.
Yeah. Well, it started out with, I knew this woman who was working at the university that I was at. She was a trainer, but she was also a dancer, and she'd converted to a Pilates instructor. And I hadn't talked to her for years, but I really liked her. And I messaged her one day. I was like, Tiffany, I need you to teach me everything you know about feet. And we started doing all these little foot exercises and ballet exercises. And I'd been working on spreading my toes. So it started out by just understanding my feet without, again, any consequence. They're not really they're not jumping, they're not running, they're not doing anything crazy. It's just feeling into them. And then I started to do a little bit more of like footwork drills, and I was learning dance moves. So like little like kicks to the side and crossing my legs and things that are just repeatable patterns over and over and over again. No choreography, really safe shoes, that kind of stuff. And it was fun. It was to music. And it was these really simple moves that I then did to a beat. And again, it started to give me that joy of like, wow, like I can do this thing to music and it's really cool. And I love to go out dancing. I don't even drink. I just love to go out dancing. And I remember I had never been able to move to a beat before with my feet. And all of a sudden I was doing it. And this person came up to me and they say, you have great, like you move really well. You have great timing. And it was like, like my soul was just like lit on fire. Like someone told me I have rhythm. Like, and so it spurred me to want to do more because it was a connection mechanism. It was so much more than that. And then by the time I started to get into running, I started to feel it like a dance move that was repeated over and over again. And I started to feel the connection between my feet and my hips, my feet and my arms, my feet and my hands, all these connection lines. And I would move my brain into like one set of connection lines, like, oh, look at the connection line between my knees and my elbows. What about my knees and my hands? And it moved into this whole other thing. And then by the time I was trying to run, I realized the way I was interacting with the ground was very different. I wasn't stepping on the ground tentatively because I was afraid to put my foot down. I was thinking, okay, how do I push my foot down into the ground to bounce back up again? And then I was doing this, but I wasn't quite getting it. I still didn't jump high and I still didn't understand plyometrics. And like jumping over a hurdle was like, I'm good. Like still not quite there yet. And then I was in Australia with my training partner, Andy White, who's another javelin thrower. He's won nationals before. He's wonderful. And he's an amazing jumper. And he can do the human flag. And he's so athletic. And we're at the practice one day and I'm trying to do these hops. And he's teaching me how to jump. And he's like, oh, you have to use your arms like this, where the elbows come back and your arms push forward down and they scoop up like a little Nike swoop. And then they pull back up again in a smaller Nike swoop on top of that. And he described this to me, and then I started to jump, and it was like I was on a pogo stick. And he was looking at me, and he's like, I've never seen you jump like that in your life. And it was because I'd understood dance and timing, and I was starting to understand, again, just the connection between my hands and my feet, and the idea of pulling myself off the ground. And all of a sudden, my arms, because they were moving up, were making my body more weightless. And it was like the most thrilling feeling I've ever experienced in my life. I was like, oh my God, I'm jumping. I get why people like this. And then my calf just went, and I couldn't run for 6 weeks not because I was doing it wrong, but because I'd never put that much force in my feet before. And I just did it a little too hard. But it was like, I cannot wait to get back to that, because I started to finally understand how it related to running and how that related. I was like, imagine if I did that, but in a javelin throw. Because I'm like, obviously, there's an arm shape for jumping straight up, but it's different than an arm shape for jumping forward. It's different for an arm shape that coordinates to running. And it's different for an arm shape that relates to javelin, which each arm is doing its own thing relative to what's happening on the ground. Because the whole point is to create energy to like earth bend, basically, like move energy through your body into the ground, have the ground reverberate back up into you, and then create a shape that allows it to funnel into an implement to leave your body. And so it just helped me understand this feeling of like, how do I work with the ground with my feet to transfer every ounce of power back up? And it just felt like a magical game.
Yeah. I love that. I love that. Like, find this, like that moment where you, or those moments where you found what your body was really capable of. You know, that thing that had been hiding, those are the best. Where it's like, that's in there. That's amazing. You know, I was just at track camp this week, like just middle school athletes. It's just funny because like I had kids going just like basic hops. I said, your feet are springs, just bounce on two legs forward, you know, not complicating it. But almost nobody can use their arms swooping forward. Everyone's arms almost go over the top. This is audio only, so it's like hard to. Basically, the arms are going backwards of a standing vertical jump. All these kids, and I, in a way, it's like I almost have to think about what would it be like if I'm an athlete who hasn't found that yet. You know what I'm saying? Like your whole jumping worldview is someone who hasn't found the arms going the other way quite yet. It's just an interesting thing to think, and we take it for granted. And I think it also fits with you. You had talked about this. You mentioned like the hands, arms, fascial system. I think you had talked a little bit to me about this before with like the hands. But it is a thing where it's very easy, I think, to go your whole life and just you never feel your hands and arms, and just because our feet are the thing that is touching, well, our shoes and our socks in the ground, and sometimes barefoot, but we rarely, like, you know, with the rope flow you're talking about, we really work our hands into the equation. So I find it more challenging to coach or give instruction to the arms absent of some of those tools that you can use for people to help them understand, okay, this is what it feels like for my arms to move this way. Even as you were talking, I was almost thinking, oh, maybe with these kids, we could just whip our arms in big giant circles and then try to catch a wave, you know, like how do you, and yeah. So there's a really interesting anecdote with that. And have you jumped over a hurdle yet since at anytime soon?
Jumped over a wall.
Oh, like, okay. So you did,
I was like, yeah. But like the thing that really helped me understand arms was, and it's like, okay, lift your toes, make like tension your legs, like make everything like totally tension in your legs. I'm like, okay. He's like, now lift yourself off the ground with your arms and these little bumps so that you're only jumping with your arms. But in order to do that, the rest of your body needs to have tension, firmness in it. The arms are the only thing that's moving. And so I started to understand it, and I was just bouncing on the ground. I had soft shoes on, and I was like, oh, it's like this. And again, it was just like this hilarious little like party trick where you're jumping and your whole body is like straight and the arms are the motor. And that was the thing that really got me to understand like the rebound capacity and the force that my arms could provide to jump absent anything else from my legs. And then I could play with range, and then I could play with other things. And then there's the other part where if you're trying to just move your arms, but you're trying to keep your hands relaxed, then what you've done is you've created no tension in the system.
Yeah.
So if you're jumping with your arms and your hands are kind of chilling, you're not tapping into the fascial system. You can play with like David Weck has like, you know, he's got these shaped fingers that you can do, but that's not quite right for the jump. You can almost kind of like extend your fingers and just try and create tension in the entire hand. And see, okay, what if I try different hand shapes, or what if I twist my wrists one way or the other? Or what if I twist my wrist one way and twist my wrist the other way? How does that create different tension, even moving the arms in and out? And playing with that tension is really important. If the ends of the fascial system are not tensioned, it will reverberate through the entire rest of the system. Same thing with throwing. If your left arm is relaxed and going, or your hand is relaxed and going down the runway like you're like wiping something, what do you think the right hand's going to do? It's going to relax too. And then what do you think is going to happen? The elbow's going to bend, the wrist is going to bend, and everything's going to kind of just do this collapsed, weird noodle thing. So wherever you want to have tension, the other side also requires creating some tension. And the hands and feet, with all their sensory organs, with all like They're your feelers. They tell you everything about what you're interacting with. They're either like an anchor to the ground or an anchor to an object. And the more you feel into that, whether it's imaginary or an actual thing, the more it allows you to give information to the rest of the system to allow you to interact better with it.
Yeah, I love that with the hands. I was just, we were, I sent you that video of Mac McClung doing that dunk, like the scorpion dunk behind, and it was
real.
I was watching his hand on the, like when it's like, it's like the rock on symbol. And it's so interesting to think, what's going on in the foot. It's almost like pinky toe, second toe, maybe forming this super strong bridge, and again, so often we just think in just all these binary terms, velocity, force, technique. But there's all these little things happening between the lines as the body connects itself specifically for that task. And it's just so fascinating. As you were talking about that, it got me thinking about, I wonder if you could almost do a cool exercise might be to exaggerate the error. Like, yeah, try doing it like that and see how terrible it feels and do that a few times. And then let your body just not do that and just notice how your body is probably not doing that. I always, all the time, when I'm doing, I mentioned like the little foot thing I tend to like to do, and I'll notice my hands are like two tacos. Like, and I'm not trying to make them do that. Like the long way. Imagine your foot, like, and people can't see it, but it's almost like this dome shape that my hands are trying to crank because they're so connected to what the foot's doing. And I just think, it's such a valuable practice for anybody to start looking at these things because, only saying, here's the position, here's the, here's this, here's these concrete terms is only going to get you so far. To me, that's part of the dance of it all is it's not just the limbs, but it's like, well, how are the limbs then connecting with each other? And that's, I've put frames up with like in the start of my presentations with like, okay, here's some masculine thinking traits, like categorization, for example, very, important and common trait to at least have, these basic structures. But the feminine is like, how do all the parts work together? And so to me, I'm like, that is an epitome of how parts are working together is watching how these hands are creating these shapes to meet the feet at this exact little time. And so, it's super cool stuff.
Yeah. Well, it's like your hands also communicate your intention. And like they're how we communicate a lot of the time. We communicate with our facial expression. And it's what makes someone interesting to have a conversation with is how well they communicate with their entire body, with their tongue, with their being. If you make it beautiful, if you make it smooth, if you speed it up, if you slow it down, whatever. And like, I think there's a lot of discouragement or there has been historically discouragement of speaking with your hands in society because it's like waving your hands around like a madman or casting spells like a witch. And so if you don't understand how to orchestrate with your hands, or you don't have experience of working with your hands in all these different ways, or you don't feel free to do so because it would look weird or exaggerated, then you actually lose control and connection of your hands. And the use of your hands isn't something that you use fluidly. So like even me, I was always encouraged to like not shut doors too hard, obviously, like for reasons. And like I would always break things. But so I became so hesitant in dealing with things that I was no longer kind of using my arms forcefully or vigorously. And it was related to the intention behind my hands. And so even playing with like tutting, like finger tutting and control, or playing an instrument or wrapping your fingers in different ways helps you feel into the fascial systems. And it's this thing where it's like, I think we're just not connected to our hands and we're not connected to our feet, partially because of like social history and like casting of our feet in shoes. And they're the highest nerve sensations, and yet we don't feel anything and we don't have control over them.
Yeah, I love when you were doing, I wish I would have this on video because the finger tutting thing, you were like, I was like, wow, you've clearly done this before. And the whole hand and foot connection, Darian Barr, who's my movement mentor, was the first person who's ever made the connection. Hey, your hands and your feet are going to be doing the same thing. What the hand's trying to do, the foot's trying to do. And he also is really into like popping and locking and tutting and all those little movement nuances. And you're just doing both of them at the same time with the fingers. And it makes me think too, like the feet, like the hands are like the helper of the feet because there's so much more. I mean, there's so much more control unless you're Harry Houdini in your hands than your feet. So what a great way to play or explore than to try all these things with your hand. It always just makes me think about how someone like these very high level athletes, like a Mac McClung, how did his system find that hand shape over time? Because I imagine he there's probably I'm not conscious that his body just does it, and bam, like I always think about how do athletes, the great ones who don't need as much extra stuff, I guess you could say. But I mean, the extra stuff is great. Like, it's the journey and it's amazing. That's why we're having this conversation. But I always kind of think about how did they just get there, or what was their process to get to where they did with some of those.
But that's the thing is, like, for some people, it's like a personality thing, or it's an environment that had a lack of self-consciousness in it that was really encouraged. It was this play. It was like, you're not doing it wrong. It wasn't, don't do it this way. It was like, just figure it out. And because you're not being ridiculed for doing something weird or doing something like other people, it doesn't even enter your mind that you shouldn't be moving that way, because there's a lot of emotional restraint based on social constriction. And our emotions, like, again, dictate the way we move. And like, the way I'm thinking about this is like, there's so many athletes who are so good, yet they didn't quite make it. And I'm like, I refuse to believe it's not because they didn't have what it takes. It's because there was something about the way they were understanding movement, or what they were allowed to do based on their social standing, that affected their capacity to move in a certain way. And that's how the majority of us exist. Like, most of us, like, don't exist in places where there isn't shame about the way we move. So it's kind of like, okay, so how do we untie these knots for people, or how do we give them permission to untie these knots? Like, I had to move in a lot of weird ways in private before I was prepared to do weird stuff in public. Now I'm one of the, like, this guy came up to me. He's like, I haven't seen you do one normal thing at the gym in the last 2 hours. I'm like, and you probably will never see me do normal thing. But like, it took me having to get over that myself, and even doing it in private was a weird thing to overcome. And I think that's where we really need to get into. And that's where we're missing out on great athletes, is it's those people who have been socially and emotionally constrained, and giving them new options for how to move and how to play with movement.
Yeah, that must be, I was going to actually ask you this before, but that must be such a strong piece where cultural rhythmic dance comes in. Like, Rafe Kelly, who's been on the show, talked about like African dance being so good for just movement in general. And I was even thinking too about, if there is fear layers, it's almost like rhythm is a little vehicle that can help you through some of those. I think especially for things that are fatiguing as well, it's like you can hang on to the rhythm, keep this rhythm going, things like that. Do you have any thoughts on that? Like the link between a dance or rhythm to overcome some of those barriers?
Absolutely. Like, I think a really big one is, so like, again, I was in Trinidad a while ago, and I didn't really know how to dance. I could kind of move my body, but I did like the white girl sway. And and I remember everybody there whines and twerks, and like, whining is just moving your hip in a circle. And it's in a lot of like Caribbean dances, African dances, but it's in a lot of other dances. Like, it's moving your hips in a circle. It's like, no one owns that one thing.
Yeah.
But there, like, if you dance in Vancouver, like, there's not exactly a dance culture here. And if you move in a way that moves your hips, people would often assume that that is sexually provocative. When really, you're moving the center of life. You are moving the lowest chakra. You are moving your spine from the most powerful point of the spinal engine. And so a lot of people, because we're afraid to move and be judged, especially women, sexually, in cultures that don't have dance, or in cultures that judge that kind of dance, it stops us from understanding our core. It stops us from understanding our hips. It makes us wonder if someone's going to judge us, and it makes us fearful of the social ramifications of being perceived a certain way. Or even for men, moving their hips a certain way and thinking that they, like, if there's shame in a culture around being gay, or not wanting to be perceived as gay, or being perceived as moving your hips badly, and then having that have repercussions on how people view your personal sexual capacity. And so, like, that first thing was so freeing, because I remember I was dancing and everybody's winding up on each other. And I'm like, whoa, this is intense. And they're like, yeah, you just go from one person to another and you dance, and it's totally cool. And like, no one's expecting anything of you. No one's judging you. And I'm like, so I'm like, I can wind up with this person and it's not weird. They're like, yeah, go for it. And I was like, this is such a change. And I felt like I was belonging to something, of everybody moving to music, and it had nothing to do with anything else other than enjoying music and movement. And it was this place where I thought, we're really getting this wrong in some of our cultures, where we think that when you dance with someone, like, it means you want more. You can't just dance with people and have a good time. And it allows you to be more free when you know that you're just doing something to be a part of a community and a part of a vibe. And it allows you to tap into your body, to energetically release things, to release tensions and quote unquote like traumas, or like things that have been bothering you that you've maybe mentally let go of, but you're still physically holding on to, or you haven't shaken off that pattern.
Yeah.
Just like people shake to let off stress, and it shakes out like the posture that you're holding that was relative to like, you just got in a car accident. What do? Like you shake it off because you need your nervous system to let go of that tension. And so it's like every time I move into dance now, I don't, I have all these other ways of moving, but like moving from my spine at the base gave me access to my core that I'd never had before. It gave me access to my spine that I'd never had before. And it gave me all these different patterns. And then it made everything else flow more freely. And so I think like that's one of the basic foundations that needs to be worked in is like, can you hit a beat? Can you bounce? That's thing one. Thing two is, can you move your hips in a circle? Thing three is, can you move that like circle up your spine? And thing four is like, can you do a wave?
Yeah.
And then after that, it's, can you combine them? And in what magical combinations can you combine them? And if you're just functioning purely in spirals and circles and waves, you can apply that to every joint, to multiple joints, across joints. And it doesn't have to be specific dance moves. And it allows you to actually play with all these different connections and find the ones that actually apply to your sport or how you want to express yourself or what emotions you want to express. And it's a whole new world of moving that allows us to actually get creative with how we move and understand all movements as a whole.
Yeah. If we have joints, we should be able to move them. And if we should be able to move them, we should be able to do so with rhythm. I remember I talked about this, it was a while ago, but I just one day it was running in the woods, and there's woods. I think about a lot of things when I run in the woods. And there was a field, and I was doing, there's this area in the trail, and I time it. It's like a 150, and I'll sprint it sometimes. And I remember I ran a couple trail 150s, and then I went to this clear field, and I did this mix of crawling like 10, 20 yards with kind of like a lot of rotation, like rotation the hips and the ribs and that motion. And then I'd stand up and just do like shake all my joints and that type of thing. And I kept repeating that. And then I went back to sprint again, and my time was instantly like a second faster, just, and you felt the hips just loose and going. And it's like, and then I'm like, I'm not just crazy. There's other people who's like, I did the same thing and I felt awesome. I had an athlete I was working with recently who drove up to train with me several times. And that was a main focus of what we worked on, was just disinhibition, shaking, finding ways to make waves work up the spine. And he dropped, this guy's into it, been training for a long time, and he chipped the 10th off of his 30 meter that he had been unable to get to budge just because he was able to work through these things. So I think there is so much there. And that, like you said, I think we tend to tag that, oh, you shouldn't do that. Like, that's not something we do here. But it's, if you have joints, it's meant to move, and the rhythm is so powerful with that. Liz, I think we're just about to the end of the questions here. It's been awesome chatting with you. What's the rest of your, I know we got the Summer Olympics coming up. How's everything going? And tell us a little bit about your journey leading into the Olympiad here this summer.
Yeah. It's been interesting. I was getting into the throw, and I was like, okay, the timing is really coming together. And I'd had some Achilles injuries, so it was a little slower than I was hoping, and I was feeling crunched for time. And I was like, great, I have like a month and a half to build up like just my timing and my rhythm. And then I pulled my groin. I was like, you've got to be kidding me. Not right now. And I always say, like, the universe gives you what you need, not what you think you want. And I have this concept that like gratitude is the most useful emotion, because if you perceive life through the lens of gratitude, then you're perceiving everything as a gift. And lessons, even hard ones, are gifts. And with this groin, initially, no, I'm pissed off like anybody else. I'm like, okay, this is obviously telling me something about my javelin technique and the way my body is moving that is not going to help me throw further. And it's stopping me now so I can figure it out and time it. And as I did that, I went to my physio, and we realized I wasn't dorsiflexing my foot again, and to the fascial system not being tensioned. And it got me on this loop about, like, I couldn't work with my feet for a little bit. So I got into my arms, and I started understanding whacking. And I started understanding my arms relative to my leg positions in the throw. And so I had about 12 days where I couldn't throw. And I was feeling a little stressed about it, but I was like, no, the universe is giving me what I need, not what I think I want. And I had a practice the other day where I tied in the left arm, where I always thought it was like a swoop one way and then a swoop another. And I realized it wasn't. It was a swoop across and then an up and then a down with an arm twist. It's because I'd spent time understanding the dance move slowly and working on my arms. And I'm at the field. I'm like, man, this feels really good. Like these throws are going really far. And someone comes up to me who's another javelin thrower. They're like, do you want me to take videos of you right now? Because these look amazing. And I was like, oh, other people can see it. This is good. So I've always I really relied on this concept again of like, if you learn 20 to 40 times faster in play than you do in work, and most of us are working, then I can make changes a lot faster than I think I can. It's not in 4 to 6 weeks like some program is telling me. And whatever that scientific thing is, like whatever time you assign to something is how long it's going to take. And I've stopped putting time limits on stuff. So I've got Harry Jerome Track Classic in Vancouver next weekend, which is a pro meet. And I've got another 3 javelin practices before then. So I'm thinking I'll be tying these things in, and I'm really excited. I wasn't excited about a week ago. I was worried, but now I'm excited. And then I've got nationals on June 27th. And those are my 2 opportunities to qualify. I said I didn't want to qualify on points, which in track, you basically accumulate points at higher level or lower level track meets. And if you throw the same distance at a low level meet as a high level meet, you'll get less points, which makes it your top 5 numbers make you qualify. But you can also just throw the automatic standard, which I believe is 64.5 or 64 meter spot. And my personal best is 64.83. And so my goal is to try and qualify with a new Canadian record and to qualify off of the automatic qualifier. So that's what I'm going on. And I kind of told myself the only way I wanted to do it was to do everything as a dance move and to do it with a lot of gratitude and to do it with the full choreography. So I'm basically spending a lot of time on choreography this month.
That's awesome. Well, I'll definitely be following you and cheering you on, Liz. Is there anywhere, if people want to learn more about you and your process and your thoughts on training and movement, is there a place they can follow you or read or learn anything more about that?
Yeah, I'm most active on Instagram, and my handle is Javeliz, Javellizz, or ZZ for you Americans. And I have a website, and I'm creating stuff. But honestly, I take notes on everything that I do, and I'm just accumulating it so that I can put all my focus on my training right now. And then there's going to be a website with hopefully a course, and I'd like to write a book. So I'm just kind of accumulating all the data before I put it together in something that is hopefully packageable and helps more athletes reach their potential.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the show, Liz. It was fantastic talking to you. I got a lot of great ideas, so I'm excited to try them out here soon, too. I'll get my javelin out, and I'll be throwing it in my side yard here soon, and lots of great things to work with. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for your amazing questions. That was great.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode. I appreciate you being here, and I'll see you next week.